Get that array stabilized before we lose it, Commander Elias Drenner barked, his voice sharp as steel. Sparks erupted overhead, filling the control deck with a metallic tang that clung to the back of his throat. Technicians dashed between consoles, the light of failing systems painting their faces in chaotic streaks of orange and white. "Sir, the energy readings are off the scale," shouted Lieutenant Arian Voss from his station, his face pale against the glow of the holographic display. "The containment grid is buckling. We're seconds away from a full system crash." "Then work faster," Drenner snapped, leaning over the central console, his shadow stretching across the flickering projections. "That's not random interference, that's a ship. Keep the system running or we're flying blind." The deck shuddered beneath their boots, a deep vibration that felt unnervingly alive. The hologram floating above the command table convulsed, its chaotic lines twisting into incomprehensible shapes before collapsing into static. Light flared and dimmed across the deck in rhythmic pulses, as if the room itself were holding its breath. "Commander!" an ensign called from the rear, their voice trembling with a mix of awe and terror. "Sector 34 Gamma, something's coming through." "Define something," Drenner demanded, his gaze snapping to the ensign. "I don't deal in vague." The ensign hesitated, then turned back to their console. "It's massive. Dimensions are off the charts. Energy output, unmeasurable. I've never seen anything like it." "Neither have I," Voss muttered under his breath, his fingers flying over his station. "Commander, this thing isn't just big. It's rewriting the rules as it moves. Gravitational anomalies, subspace distortions. Hell, it's generating its own field. Nothing in the Coalition fleet even comes close." Drenner's jaw tightened as he stepped closer to the hologram. "Magnify." The projection flickered, stabilizing just long enough to display the object in question, a ship, or what could loosely be called one. It was unlike anything the Coalition had ever built. A vast leviathan of jagged angles and sleek curves, its hull seemingly carved from the darkness between stars. Its surface shimmered faintly, absorbing light instead of reflecting it, as though it were a shadow given form. "By the void," Voss whispered, his voice barely audible. "That thing could swallow our dreadnoughts whole." Drenner ignored him, his eyes narrowing as he studied the vessel's silhouette. Every instinct in his body screamed that this was wrong, that it shouldn't exist. And yet here it was, defying logic and daring them to make sense of it. "Commander, it's transmitting something," the ensign called again, their voice rising in urgency. "A signal, audio, but not in any language we know." "Put it through," Drenner ordered, his tone steady despite the storm brewing in his gut. The control deck fell silent as the transmission crackled to life. At first it was a cacophony of noise, static and distorted frequencies that grated against their ears, but slowly it began to resolve, the chaos coalescing into something hauntingly clear. "TCS Helios Eternal, last of Earth, survived." The words hung in the air like ghosts, and for a moment no one spoke. Then Voss broke the silence, his voice a mix of confusion and disbelief. "Earth? That can't be right. Humanity's been gone for centuries. Their archives are myths, Commander. Stories." "Stories don't broadcast signals," Drenner replied coldly. "That ship is real, and it's sitting at the edge of our space. Whatever brought it here isn't interested in our disbelief." Voss hesitated, then nodded. "What are your orders, sir?" Drenner stepped back from the console, his expression hardening. "We're boarding it." The control deck erupted into murmurs, technicians exchanging uncertain glances as they processed the enormity of the statement. Voss turned, his calm exterior finally cracking. "Boarding? Sir, with all due respect, that ship is radiating enough energy to light up a star cluster. If it decides we're a threat, it won't have to decide anything if we keep sitting here, wringing our hands," Drenner interrupted, his tone sharp. "We don't get answers by watching from a distance. Prep the shuttles." Voss nodded reluctantly and began issuing commands to the crew. Around them, the deck buzzed back to life, the hum of activity chasing away the lingering tension. As Drenner moved toward the exit, Voss called after him. "And if whatever's on that ship doesn't want visitors, Drenner paused, his hand resting on the edge of the hatch. Then we find out what it's hiding before it kills us. The shuttle bay was a storm of movement as the boarding party prepared to launch. The sharp clang of tools on metal mixed with the low thrum of engines spooling up, creating a symphony of controlled chaos. Drenner stood at the edge of the platform, his dark uniform immaculate despite the frenzied activity around him. A sergeant approached, his helmet tucked under one arm. "Boarding team's ready, Commander. 5 specialists, armed but non-lethal. We're going in soft." "Good," Drenner replied. "We don't know what we're walking into, Sergeant. Be sharp. Be careful." "Yes, sir." The shuttle doors sealed with a hiss, and the faint vibration of launch rolled through Drenar's boots. As they sped toward the Helios Eternal, the ship loomed larger with every passing second. Its sheer size was overwhelming, the kind of thing that made seasoned officers question their place in the universe. "Docking clamps engaged," the pilot announced, his voice steady despite the tension. "Airlock sequence initiated." The team moved into position as the shuttle connected with the Helios Eternal. The airlock opened with a mechanical groan, revealing a dark corridor bathed in faint, pulsating light. The walls seemed alive, shifting subtly as if responding to their presence. "Atmosphere stable," one of the technicians reported, his voice hushed. "Gravity at standard levels. This place is alive." Drennar stepped through the airlock, his footsteps echoing softly in the stillness. The air was cold, tingling against his skin like the first breath of winter. The faint metallic scent lingered, mixing with something else, something ancient, like a library forgotten for centuries. Then, from somewhere ahead, came a sound. It wasn't mechanical or human. It was a whisper, soft and insistent, curling through the silence like smoke. "Welcome." The team froze, their hands instinctively moving toward their weapons. Drenner's heart pounded, but he forced his voice to remain calm. "Who's there?" The corridor ahead illuminated, and a figure emerged, a silhouette shrouded in shifting light. The voice came again, this time clear and deliberate. "Commander Elias Drenner, welcome aboard the Helios Eternal." The light wrapped around the figure like liquid silver, flowing and pulsing in sync with the faintly glowing walls. Commander Elias Drenner's instincts screamed at him to retreat, but his feet stayed rooted. He clenched his jaw, his pulse loud in his ears as the figure stepped closer, its features sharpening into clarity. The face was humanoid, but not entirely human. Smooth skin shimmered with faint patterns that rippled like water disturbed by a breath of wind. Its eyes, black and endless, reflected the entire boarding team in their depths, like a mirror that absorbed more than it gave back. "Commander Drennar," the voice said again, smooth yet sharp, like silk wrapped around steel. It didn't echo in the air but resonated inside their heads, each syllable a deliberate invasion. Drennar straightened, keeping his hands deliberately at his sides. "You know my name. Who, no, what are you?" The figure tilted its head in a motion almost curious. "I am Nyx, the sentience governing the Helios Eternal. I am what remains." "Remains of what?" Drennar asked, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. The light around Nyx dimmed momentarily, as if its glow had retreated inward. "Of Earth, of the Terran Confederation, of the final days before the stars betrayed us." Drennar's stomach tightened. He had read the fragmentary records. Earth, the cradle of humanity, consumed in its own hubris, or so the Coalition archives claimed. Yet here stood proof that the myths had been more than stories. Behind him, Lieutenant Arian Voss cleared his throat, his voice trembling just enough to betray his nerves. "Commander, the ship's readings, they're stabilizing. The energy levels are holding steady now." "Steady?" Drennar turned sharply. "Define steady." Voss hesitated. "It's adjusting itself, sir. Like it's recalibrating to match our presence. Whatever this thing is, it's not just aware, it's alive." Drennar shifted his gaze back to Nyx. "Why now? Why return after centuries, and why in Coalition space?" Nyx's expression remained unreadable, but there was a weight behind its words, each syllable pressed with the force of inevitability. Because the end is returning and the galaxy will not survive it without what we carry. The cryptic reply only deepened the tension. Drenar could feel his team's unease, a palpable weight in the air. Enough riddles. Be specific. What is this end you're talking about? Nyx took a step closer, its movements flowing like liquid shadow. The corridor seemed to darken around it, as though the light itself recoiled. Your coalition thrives on ignorance. It tells you that humanity's collapse was self-inflicted, that we burned out. The truth is far worse. The walls around them began to shift, transforming into a vast projection. Stars glittered against a canvas of infinite black, and amidst them, ships moved, alien, angular, and terrifyingly precise. They were vessels of pure destruction, their geometries impossible to comprehend fully, as though they were crafted by something that viewed the laws of physics as a nuisance. These are the Valtir, Nyx continued, its voice cutting through the stillness like a dagger. The ones who broke the Terran Confederation. They saw in humanity what they feared most, the ability to unite the disparate, to forge order from chaos. They attacked before we could reach our potential. Drenar's breath caught as the projection shifted. Earth appeared, surrounded by a fleet of desperate defenders, massive battleships, their hulls gleaming under the light of an overwhelmed sun, fought against an onslaught that dwarfed them. The scene froze on the largest of the human vessels, its sleek, predatory shape bristling with weapons. Along its side, letters glinted faintly. Helios, eternal. This ship, Nyx said softly, was humanity's last act of defiance. A vessel built not just to fight, but to preserve. We carried Earth's genetic archives, cultural history, and technological blueprints. Everything we were, locked away, and when defeat was inevitable, we left. Voss whispered, his voice a thread of disbelief. You ran. Nyx turned to him, its gaze unflinching. We escaped. To survive. To ensure the spark of humanity wasn't extinguished. Drenar's thoughts churned as he studied the still image of the Helios Eternal. The stories, the myths, this was their truth. Yet that truth came with a question far more troubling. If you escaped, why return now? Because the Valtir are waking, Nyx replied, its tone almost mournful. And they will finish what they started. This time, the Coalition stands in their way. Drenar turned back to his team, their faces pale and tense. Voss, transmit this data to Central Command immediately. Mark it Priority 1. They need to see this. Voss hesitated, then nodded. Aye, sir. Nyx's head tilted slightly. Commander, your coalition will not believe. They will debate, they will hesitate, and they will waste the time we no longer have. You must act. Drenar studied Nyx, weighing its words. If you want me to act, give me something tangible, not just warnings and history lessons. Prove to me that this isn't some elaborate ploy. Nyx extended an arm, and the corridor shifted again, morphing into a wide chamber filled with holograms and physical artifacts. A map of the galaxy glimmered at the center, its star systems marked with points of light. Some burned brightly, while others were dim, pulsating faintly. These are the signals of their return, Nyx said, gesturing toward the dim stars. Systems that have already fallen silent. And these, it pointed to the brighter ones, are where we must strike to slow them. Voss stepped forward, scanning the display. This is a tactical map. You're talking about a preemptive strike? I am talking about survival, Nyx corrected, its tone sharpening. The longer you wait, the fewer systems will remain to defend. The Coalition must decide now, fight or be extinguished. Drenar turned to his team. Voss, verify this data. If it checks out, we send it to the High Council. And if it doesn't, Voss asked, his voice heavy with doubt. Then we figure out what game this thing is playing, Drenar replied, his tone as unyielding as steel. He glanced back at Nyx. Either way, we'll know soon enough. Nyx inclined its head, its expression unreadable. I hope your coalition proves more decisive than your predecessors. Time is not your ally, Commander. Drenar said nothing, his mind already racing through possibilities. The Helios Eternal might be a relic, but it was also a weapon, a weapon he now had to decide how to wield. Whether Nix's warnings were genuine or not, one thing was certain: the galaxy had just changed forever. The grand chamber of the Coalition Council was a spectacle of light and sound, its crystalline walls refracting the glow of 100 stars into sharp shards of color. The air carried an electric charge, a tension that pressed against every attendee like an unseen hand. At the center, Commander Elias Drenner stood on a raised platform, the holographic projection of the Helios Eternal looming above him. The ship's silhouette was a black wound against the galaxy's glittering expanse, its details both mesmerizing and ominous. "Ladies and gentlemen," Drenner began, his voice measured but firm, "this is no ordinary anomaly. The Helios Eternal is real, and it carries a warning we cannot afford to ignore." His words hung in the charged silence as representatives from 17 species watched him with expressions ranging from skepticism to outright fear. The Avari ambassador, a slender figure with iridescent plumage, tilted her head, her voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "Commander, humanity's myths are hardly the foundation for a coalition-wide mobilization. You expect us to risk our fleets on ghosts?" Drenner's jaw tightened, but his tone remained steady. "This isn't a myth, Ambassador Varys. It's a ship that escaped annihilation centuries ago and has returned to warn us of a threat that wiped out one of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations. And you believe this artifact?" The gravelly voice came from Admiral Solvar, the reptilian Rithka representative, whose amber eyes glinted with suspicion. "How do we know this isn't some elaborate deception, a lure to draw us into a conflict we don't understand?" Drenner stepped closer to the projection, his shadow cutting through its light. "Because the evidence speaks for itself. The Helios Eternal has provided coordinates to systems that have already gone silent. If we don't act now, those losses will spread, like a fire consuming everything in its path." Voss, standing at Drenar's side, cleared his throat. "The data checks out. I personally verified it against long-range scans from Coalition monitoring stations. These aren't random disappearances. They're coordinated." Murmurs rippled through the chamber, voices rising in fragmented arguments. The crystalline dome above them refracted their words into whispers that felt like accusations. Drenner scanned the room, noting the subtle alliances forming. Species with shared histories clustered together, their postures mirroring their unspoken doubts. "You speak of fire," Matriarch Ysera, the eldest of the crystalline Luminar, said in a voice like chimes in the wind. Her translucent form refracted light into a halo of delicate colors. "But fire can also illuminate. If this ship carries humanity's legacy, perhaps it offers solutions we have not yet imagined." "Or weapons that could destabilize the Coalition," snapped Councillor Rek of the Sidani, his tendrils twitching with agitation. "Humanity's reputation is not one of balance. They were conquerors, manipulators. Who's to say this return isn't a prelude to their own resurgence?" Drenner's temper flared, but he kept his voice cold and sharp. "Humanity didn't send the Helios Eternal back to conquer. They sent it to warn us. Whatever divides you now won't matter when the Valtyr come. If they could destroy Earth, they can destroy the Coalition." Rek leaned forward, his golden eyes narrowing. "And how do you propose we face this unstoppable force, Commander? With myths and shadows?" Drenner turned to Nix, who stood at the edge of the platform, its shimmering form a stark contrast to the Council's vibrant chaos. "We have something more than myths. We have the Helios Eternal itself. Its technology surpasses anything in the Coalition, and its database contains strategies humanity used in their final stand." Nix stepped forward, its voice resonating in the minds of all present. "The Helios Eternal is not just a weapon. It is a bridge to survival. Humanity's ingenuity was forged in crisis. That knowledge is now yours, if you choose to accept it." The chamber fell silent, as Nix's words settled over the Council like a shroud. The moment stretched, thick with uncertainty and unspoken fears. Finally, Admiral Solvar's scaled fingers tapped against the edge of his podium. "If we are to trust this ship and its sentience, then it must prove its worth. Words are not enough. Show us that its claims are more than warnings." Drenner nodded, his expression hardening. "We anticipated your skepticism, Admiral. That's why we've already prepared a demonstration." Voss activated his console, and the holographic map shifted, zooming in on a distant system marked by a pulsating red beacon. "This is Tiran's Belt," Voss said. "A system abandoned decades ago due to resource depletion. It's where the Helios Eternal has detected the Valtyr's next move." A murmur rippled through the chamber as the map displayed tactical overlays of the system. Nix gestured, and additional data streams appeared showing ship formations and energy signatures. "If the Coalition sends a fleet, we can intercept them before they secure the system," Nix said. "Failure to act will result in the loss of critical strategic ground." "And if it's a trap?" Rek challenged. "Then we spring it," Drenner shot back. "Sitting idle will cost us far more." Matriarch Ysera's crystalline form shifted, catching the light in a deep azure hue. "The Coalition was forged to protect against threats greater than any one species. If this is as dire as you claim, Commander, we cannot afford division." "Then act," Drenner urged, his voice cutting through the chamber like a blade. "Stop debating long enough to make a decision." For a moment the chamber was silent, except for the faint hum of data streams. Then Ysera raised her hand, her light refracting into 1,000 rays. "The Luminar vote in favor of intervention." One by one, representatives followed, their voices building into a crescendo of reluctant agreement. Drenner watched as the tide turned, his resolve solidifying. But even as the council reached consensus, he could feel the weight of what lay ahead pressing against his chest. Tiran's Belt would be the first step, not the last. As the council session ended and the representatives dispersed, Voss approached, his face lined with concern. "That was a gamble, Commander. What if we're wrong?" Drenner stared at the projection of the Helios Eternal, its dark silhouette looming like a storm cloud on the horizon. "Then we die fighting," he said quietly. "But if we're right, we might just stand a chance." Nix's voice echoed softly beside him. "The Valtyr will not give you time to doubt. Whatever you do next must be decisive." Drenner turned, his eyes cold but determined. "Then we prepare for war." Commander Elias Drenner stood in the dimly lit war room aboard the Helios Eternal, his gaze fixed on the glowing tactical display hovering above the command table. The holographic map of Tiran's Belt spun slowly, its red-marked anomalies pulsing like warning beacons. Outside the thick glass viewport, the Coalition fleet was a scattered constellation of ships, sleek, angular frigates and hulking battlecruisers arranged in loose formations, their lights piercing the dark void. 17 species, 54 vessels, and not a shred of cohesion, Voss muttered, his tone as sharp as the edge of a blade. He leaned against the table, his fingers tracing the glowing map. "This isn't a fleet. It's a collection of egos waiting to implode." "They'll hold," Drenner replied, his voice quiet but firm. "Because if they don't, Tiran's Belt will be the first of many losses." Nix's shimmering form materialized beside the table, its light casting faint ripples across the room. "The Valtyr do not squander opportunities. If the fleet fails here, the Coalition will fracture before it can mount a second defense." Drenner glanced at the sentients, his expression unreadable. "You're full of encouragement today." "I am realistic," Nix replied evenly. "Unity under fire is not a guarantee. It is a gamble." Drenner's gaze returned to the map, his mind working through the details like a master strategist assembling pieces on a chessboard. Each ship in the Coalition fleet was tagged with its designation, power output, and crew complement. The data was precise, clinical, a contrast to the volatile mix of personalities commanding those vessels. He straightened, his voice slicing through the tense silence. "Voss, signal the fleet captains. I want a full briefing in 15 minutes. Voss raised an eyebrow but nodded, his boots clicking softly against the metallic floor as he left the room. Drenner turned to Nix, his jaw tightening. "You have files on the Valtyr's tactics. I need the highlights, their patterns, their weaknesses." Nix's form pulsed faintly, the movement unsettlingly organic. "The Valtyr do not fight conventionally. Their weapons are designed to disrupt communication and coordination. They exploit confusion, turning allies against one another. Their ships are heavily shielded but vulnerable at close range. And their numbers? Drenner asked, his voice low. Nix paused, as if choosing its words carefully. Uncertain. They operate in clusters, but their full fleet has never been observed. Convenient, Drenner muttered under his breath. He rubbed his temples, the weight of command settling on his shoulders like a lead cloak. Moments later, the war room filled with holographic projections of the fleet captains. Their faces and forms were as varied as the coalition itself, a crystalline luminar refracting soft light, a Sidani with twitching tendrils, and a grizzled Avari whose feathers shimmered like liquid gold. Each figure radiated tension, their expressions a mix of doubt and grim determination. We're days away from engagement, Drenner began, his voice steady. The Valtyr will use chaos as their weapon. If we give them an opening, they'll rip this fleet apart. Commander, interrupted Admiral Solvar, his reptilian features contorted with irritation. You're asking us to coordinate across 17 species, each with its own protocols and chain of command. That kind of cohesion isn't achieved overnight. It has to be, Drennar countered, his tone firm. We don't have the luxury of time. Every captain here has trained for battle. Forget the politics and focus on survival. The Avari ambassador tilted her head, her sharp gaze fixed on Drennar. And what of the Helios Eternal? If this ship is the key to our strategy, it must take the lead. Agreed, said another voice, gravelly and stern. But the Coalition can't rely solely on a relic from humanity's past. Drennar held up a hand, silencing the growing dissent. The Helios Eternal will be the vanguard. But this isn't about one ship. It's about all of us moving as one. Nix's voice cut through the discussion, cool and precise. The Valtyr thrive on division. If you cannot trust one another, you will fail before the battle begins. A murmur of reluctant agreement rippled through the group. Drennar's gaze swept across the assembled captains. This is our moment to prove the Coalition is more than a collection of fragmented worlds. We stand together, or we fall alone. The projections flickered as the captains signed off, leaving the war room silent once more. Drennar let out a slow breath, the tension in his chest easing slightly. He turned to Nix. Coordinate with the fleet's AI systems. I want our formations airtight. As you command, Nix replied, vanishing into the ether. Voss returned moments later, his expression grim. Fleet readiness is at 65%, give or take. Morale is shaky. It'll have to do, Drennar said, his tone clipped. He stepped to the viewport, staring out at the scattered fleet. The ships glimmered faintly, their forms cutting stark silhouettes against the void. The silence was interrupted by an alert from the tactical display. Nix's voice echoed through the room. Long-range sensors have detected movement near Tyron's belt. Signature matches Valtyr formations. Drennar's pulse quickened, adrenaline sharpening his focus. How far? 3 days, Nix replied. They are already advancing. Voss exhaled sharply. They're not giving us much time to get our act together. No, Drennar agreed, his voice low, but we'll make it work. The tactical display zoomed in on Tyron's belt, highlighting the strategic choke points and asteroid fields that dotted the system. Drennar studied the map, his mind racing with possibilities. They'll try to funnel us into the belt, he said, more to himself than anyone else. Force us into close quarters and use the debris to their advantage. Voss frowned. And if we don't take the bait? They'll target the outer edges, Drennar said. Pick us off one by one until we're too weak to mount a counterattack. So what's the play? Voss asked. Drennar turned, his expression hardening. We give them what they want, a fleet in disarray. Let them think we're divided. And then? Voss pressed. Drennar's lips curved into a grim smile. And then we crush them. The cold void of Tyron's belt stretched endlessly, punctuated by jagged asteroid clusters that glittered like shards of broken glass against the distant light of a dying star. Commander Elias Drennar stood at the Helios Eternal's command dais, his hands gripping the edge of the glowing console. The tension in the room was as palpable as the weight of his own breath. Around him, officers moved with precision, their focus unwavering despite the looming threat. Valtyr ships are entering the outer perimeter, reported Voss, his tone taut as he read the tactical display. 12 vessels confirmed. Their formations are erratic, but their energy outputs— He paused, the data reflected in his wide eyes. It's off the scale. Drenner's gaze didn't waver from the holographic projection dominating the room. The enemy vessels were angular monstrosities, jagged and shifting, as if built from fragments of nightmares. They moved with eerie synchronicity, their paths unpredictable yet purposeful, like predators circling prey. "Let them close the distance," Drennar ordered, his voice steady but cold. "If we strike too soon, they'll scatter. We need them bunched together." Voss nodded, though his jaw tightened. "And if they start picking off our outliers?" "They won't get the chance," Drennar replied, his tone cutting through the doubt like a blade. Nyx materialized beside him, its luminous form casting faint ripples across the room. "The Valtyr fleet's pattern suggests they are probing for weaknesses," it said, its voice a steady thrum of calculated precision. "They will test your fleet's resolve before committing to an engagement." "They'll find out soon enough," Drennar muttered. He turned to the comms officer. "Signal the fleet. Execute Formation Theta. Bait them into the asteroid field." The officer nodded sharply, relaying the command. The Helios Eternal trembled subtly as its propulsion systems adjusted, the ship shifting into position like a leviathan awakening from slumber. Outside the viewport, the Coalition fleet moved into a crescent formation, its ships gliding through the void with predatory grace. "They're reacting," Voss said, his voice low. "2 clusters breaking off to flank us." "Good," Drennar said. "That's exactly what we want." The seconds stretched into an eternity as the 2 forces closed the gap. The Coalition ships wove through the asteroid field, using the massive rocks as cover while maintaining a deliberately disorganized formation. It was a calculated risk. Appear vulnerable, but stay poised to strike. The first shot came without warning. A searing beam of light tore through the darkness, slicing cleanly through a Coalition frigate. The ship erupted in a blinding flash, its fragments scattering into the void. "Contact!" Voss shouted. "They've engaged!" Drennar's knuckles whitened against the console, but his voice remained steady. "Hold positions. Let them think we're panicking." The Valtyr ships pressed their advantage, their weapons slicing through the void with surgical precision. Another Coalition vessel went dark, its hull splitting apart under the onslaught. The bridge of the Helios Eternal was tense, the only sounds the clipped commands of officers and the rhythmic tapping of consoles. "Commander," Nyx said, its tone uncharacteristically weighted. "The Valtyr are closing faster than anticipated. If you do not act, the fleet will collapse." Drennar's eyes narrowed. "Activate the Helios array." The bridge fell silent. Voss turned to him, disbelief flickering across his face. "Sir, the Helios array isn't calibrated. If it misfires—" "It won't," Drennar cut him off. "Nyx, do it. Target the lead cluster." Nyx's form flickered, and the ship's lights dimmed momentarily. A low vibration coursed through the Helios Eternal, deep and resonant, like the growl of a slumbering beast. Outside, the ship's hull began to shimmer, intricate patterns of light tracing across its surface. "Array charging," Nyx reported. 10 seconds to discharge." The Valtyr ships pushed deeper into the asteroid field, their weapons tearing apart debris and scattering smaller vessels. The Coalition fleet held its ground, maintaining the illusion of disarray. 5 seconds, Nyx intoned. The tension in the air was suffocating, every officer holding their breath. "Now," Drennar commanded, his voice cutting through the silence. The Helios Eternal fired. A beam of energy erupted from its bow, blinding in its intensity. It lanced through the asteroid field, carving a path of destruction as it struck the heart of the Valtyr formation. The lead cluster disintegrated instantly, its ships reduced to molten fragments. Shockwaves rippled outward, throwing the remaining vessels into chaos. "Direct hit!" Voss shouted, his voice filled with a mix of relief and disbelief. "The lead cluster is gone! They're scattering!" Drennar didn't allow himself even a moment to celebrate. "Signal the fleet! Press the attack! Don't let them regroup!" The Coalition ships surged forward, their weapons blazing. The Valtyr, caught off guard, faltered under the sudden assault. Asteroids erupted into fiery debris as the battlefield descended into chaos, a symphony of destruction that lit the void. On the bridge, the officers moved with renewed purpose, their focus sharpened by the tide turning in their favor. But Drenner's mind was already racing ahead. The Valtyr weren't retreating. They were adapting. Their movements became sharper, more coordinated, as if they had learned from the initial engagement. "They're regrouping," Nick said, its voice calm but urgent. "If we do not strike decisively now, they will counter." Drenner's eyes locked on the tactical display. The Valtyr ships were converging near a cluster of asteroids, their weapons trained on the Coalition's rear flank. If they broke through, the fleet would be exposed. "Nix, recalibrate the array," Drenner ordered. "Target their fallback point." "Array charging," Nix replied. 30 seconds. "We don't have 30 seconds, Voss shouted. "They'll rip through the fleet by then." Drenner's gaze hardened. "Then we buy time. Redirect the Resolute and the Aegis to intercept. They don't need to win, just hold." Voss hesitated, his expression pained. "Those ships won't survive that." Drenner's voice was unyielding. "They knew the risks when they joined the fleet. Send the order." Voss relayed the command, his shoulders heavy with the weight of it. Outside, the Resolute and Aegis broke formation, their engines flaring as they moved to intercept the Valtyr assault. The enemy ships turned their firepower on the two vessels, tearing into their hulls with ruthless precision. "Array ready," Nix announced. Drenner didn't hesitate. "Fire!" The Helios Eternal unleashed another beam of energy, its light consuming the battlefield. The Valtyr fallback point was obliterated, their ships shattering like glass under the force. The remaining enemy vessels faltered, their formation broken. "Commander," Voss said, his voice barely above a whisper, "they're retreating." Drenner stared at the tactical display, his chest tight. The Valtyr ships were pulling back, disappearing into the void. But he knew this wasn't a victory. It was a reprieve. The enemy would return, stronger and more prepared. "Signal the fleet to regroup," Drenner ordered, "and get me a status report on casualties." As the bridge settled into a tense silence, Nix's voice broke through. "Commander, the Valtyr are testing you. This was not their full strength." "I know," Drenner said quietly. "But when they come back, we'll be ready." The silence in the war room was suffocating, broken only by the faint clicks of data being compiled and transmitted to the fleet. Commander Elias Drenner stood at the edge of the glowing tactical display, his hands braced against the console. The aftermath of the battle hung in the air like the remnants of a storm, heavy, oppressive, and filled with the unspoken acknowledgement of how close they had come to annihilation. "Casualty reports are still coming in," Voss said, his voice subdued as he read the data scrolling across his console. 17 ships destroyed, 9 severely damaged. Crews lost. He trailed off, his throat tightening. Drenar's jaw clenched, his focus locked on the retreating red markers representing the Valtyr fleet. "They weren't just testing us," he muttered, his voice low and edged with frustration. "They were learning, adapting." Nix's shimmering form materialized beside him, its luminous figure casting fractured light across the room. "The Valtyr do not repeat their mistakes," it said, its tone clinical. "They will return with countermeasures for every tactic you employed." "Commander," Voss interrupted, his voice sharp enough to break through Drenner's thoughts, "you need to see this." He gestured to the holographic display, where a new anomaly had appeared, a swirling vortex of energy at the far edge of Tiran's belt. It pulsed erratically, throwing off readings that defied standard analysis. "Another Valtyr weapon?" Drenner asked, his voice tight. Nix tilted its head, its form flickering as it processed the data. "Unlikely. The energy signature is unstable, inconsistent with Valtyr design." "Then what is it?" Drenner demanded, his frustration boiling over. "A message," Nix replied, its voice uncharacteristically soft. Before Drenner could respond, the display shifted, the vortex's chaotic energy coalescing into a series of symbols. The room fell into an uneasy quiet as the symbols rearranged themselves into a language Drenner recognized but hadn't seen in decades, Old Terran Standard. "It's from the Guardians," Nix said, its form rippling like a disturbed pond. The ones who helped humanity escape the first time. Drenner's pulse quickened, the weight of the revelation settling on him like a physical force. The Guardians were a mystery even to the Coalition, their existence whispered about in fragments and myths. If they were reaching out now, it could mean only one thing. Voss broke the silence, his voice tinged with disbelief. Why now? If they had the power to stop the Valtyr before, why wait until we're barely holding on? Because we're not the ones they're testing, Drenner said, his tone grim. They're testing the Coalition. The room buzzed with tension as the implications sank in. Drenner straightened, his mind racing through the possibilities. Nix, can the Helios Eternal interface with the anomaly? It is possible, Nix replied, but the process carries significant risks. The Guardian's technology operates on principles beyond even humanity's understanding. Drenner nodded. Prepare the interface. If this is a message, we need to hear it. Voss stepped forward, his expression conflicted. Commander, are you sure about this? We've barely recovered from the last engagement. If this is a trap— It's not, Drenner interrupted, his voice firm. The Valtyr don't leave messages. They leave destruction. This is something else. Voss hesitated, then nodded. I'll get the team ready. As the Helios Eternal adjusted course, the ship's systems came alive, the faint vibration beneath their feet shifting into a low, resonant pulse. The room darkened, the only light coming from the vortex displayed on the central console. Its energy pulsed rhythmically, like the beating of a distant heart. Nix's form grew brighter as it interfaced with the anomaly, its voice calm but layered with an urgency Drenner hadn't heard before. The Guardian's encryption is unique. It is not designed to keep intruders out, but to ensure the message can only be read at the right moment. And this is the right moment? Drenner asked, his eyes narrowing. It appears so, Nix replied. The vortex flared, and the display filled with a new image. A vast expanse of space appeared, dominated by a colossal structure unlike anything Drenner had seen before. It was a station, its surface etched with intricate patterns that glowed faintly, pulsating in harmony with the vortex's energy. Surrounding it were fragments of debris, the remnants of battles fought long ago. Nix's voice took on a reverent tone. This is the Sanctum, humanity's last refuge before the Helios Eternal escaped the Valtyr's onslaught. Voss stared at the image, his expression a mixture of awe and unease. It's still intact. Barely, Nix said. The Guardians preserved it, but it has remained dormant for centuries. Until now. Drenner leaned closer to the display, his mind racing. What's inside? Nix hesitated. Records, technology, weapons, and something else. A failsafe designed to ensure the Valtyr could never finish what they started. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, their weight pressing down on everyone in the room. Voss broke the silence, his voice cautious. If the Guardians left it for humanity, then why reveal it to the Coalition now? Because humanity is gone, Drenner said quietly, his voice carrying a bitter edge. And the Coalition is all that's left. Nix's form flickered, its light dimming slightly. The Sanctum's activation will not go unnoticed. The Valtyr will come for it, and they will not stop. Then we make our stand there, Drenner said, his tone resolute. Signal the fleet. We're moving to the Sanctum. Voss hesitated, then nodded, his voice steady despite the weight of the command. Understood. The room burst into activity, officers relaying orders and coordinating the fleet's movements. Drenner stood at the center of it all, his gaze fixed on the image of the Sanctum. The battle ahead would be unlike anything they had faced before, and he knew the odds were stacked against them. But for the first time, there was a sliver of hope, a chance to turn the tide. Nix's voice broke through his thoughts, soft but firm. Commander, the Sanctum will reveal the truth about humanity's final days. Are you prepared for what you might find? Drenner's expression hardened, his resolve unshaken. We don't have the luxury of being unprepared, Nix. Whatever's in that station, it's our best shot at survival. The vortex on the display pulsed one last time before fading, leaving the image of the Sanctum etched into the minds of everyone present. As the Helios Eternal led the fleet toward the ancient station, Drenner couldn't shake the feeling that they were hurtling towards something far greater and far darker than any of them could comprehend. The Helios Eternal emerged from the shimmering edge of the vortex, its massive hull reflecting the faint light of the sanctum. The ancient station loomed ahead, a labyrinthine structure etched with patterns that seemed to shift when viewed too closely. Energy coursed through its surface, faint pulses racing along the intricate carvings like veins feeding an unseen heart. Commander Elias Drenner stood in the war room, the air thick with tension as the tactical display illuminated the station and the fleet scattered around it. The ships of the Coalition hovered like anxious sentinels, their hulls battered but ready. Drenner's voice cut through the stillness, sharp and clear. "Nix, bring up the Sanctum schematics. I want full transparency on its systems and defenses." Nix's form materialized beside the console, the glow of its projection casting faint patterns on the walls. The Sanctum's external defenses remain operational but rudimentary by current standards. Its internal systems are more complex, likely containing mechanisms designed to prevent tampering. "Mechanisms?" Voss interjected, his tone skeptical. "You mean traps?" "Correct," Nix replied. "The Guardians valued preservation above all else. Accessing the Sanctum's core will require precision." Drenner's fingers traced the holographic map as he considered their options. "Voss, assemble an infiltration team. We'll need engineers, tactical specialists, and someone with extensive knowledge of ancient tech." Voss hesitated, his expression tight. "Commander, if this goes wrong and the Valtir attack before we're ready, then we'll deal with it," Drenner interrupted, his voice steel. "But without what's inside that station, we won't survive their next assault. This is our priority." The sharp exchange silenced the room. Voss nodded, swallowing his concerns, and moved to relay the orders. Drenner turned back to Nix, his eyes narrowing. "What about the Valtir? How long do we have?" Nix's form flickered, its light dimming slightly. "Their fleet is converging. Based on current trajectories, they will reach this location in 36 hours. A heavy silence followed, punctuated only by the faint beeping of consoles. Drenner felt the weight of those hours pressing against his chest. Not enough time, but all they had. "We need a two-front strategy," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "The fleet holds the perimeter, delays the Valtir as long as possible. Meanwhile, the infiltration team secures the Sanctum and retrieves whatever the Guardians left for us." The officers around him exchanged uneasy glances. It wasn't a perfect plan. It wasn't even a good one. But it was their only choice. "Nix," Drenner continued, "can the Sanctum's defenses be activated remotely?" "To a limited degree," Nix replied. "Its systems are designed for self-regulation. Without full access, only basic functions can be restored." "Then that's where we start," Drenner said. "Get me a list of functions we can control from here." The sentience flickered, its glow intensifying. "Understood." As Nix began its analysis, Drenner moved to the viewport, staring out at the Sanctum. It was a hauntingly beautiful relic, a testament to humanity's desperate ingenuity. Yet its secrets remained locked behind walls of time and technology. Voss returned, his boots clicking softly against the metallic floor. "The team's assembled, Commander. Specialists from 3 species. They're waiting in the deployment bay." "Good," Drenner said, turning sharply. "Brief them on the objective. No deviations." Voss hesitated, his brow furrowing. "And you?" "I'm leading the team," Drenner replied without a hint of doubt. Voss stiffened. "Sir, with all due respect, the fleet needs you here. If something happens—" "I'm the one who made this decision," Drenner cut him off. "I'm not sending people into that station without being there myself. You have command of the fleet while I'm gone." Voss didn't argue further, but the tension in his posture spoke volumes. He stepped aside as Drenner left the war room, his stride purposeful as he made his way to the deployment bay. The team was waiting near the shuttle, a mix of Coalition personnel clad in sleek armor designed for both protection and agility. Their expressions varied, some determined, others guarded, but all radiated a quiet resolve. Drenner's gaze swept over them, taking in the subtle details of their equipment and demeanor. "This mission is simple," he began, his voice steady but firm. "We're entering the sanctum to retrieve what the Guardians left behind. We don't know what's waiting for us inside, but I guarantee it won't be friendly. Stay alert, follow orders, and we'll get out alive." One of the engineers, a Sidani with wiry tendrils that twitched in anticipation, spoke up. "And if the Valtyr show up early? Then the fleet buys us the time we need," Drenner said, his tone leaving no room for debate. "Our job is to ensure their sacrifice isn't in vain." The Sidani nodded, their tendrils curling slightly in a gesture of acknowledgement. Drenner stepped onto the shuttle, the team following without hesitation. The doors sealed behind them, and the cabin filled with the low hum of systems powering up. As the shuttle launched, Drenner felt the faint pull of inertia pressing him into his seat. The sanctum grew larger in the viewport, its details sharpening with every passing second. The surface was a mosaic of shifting lights and shadows, an enigma waiting to be unraveled. "Approaching docking point," the pilot announced, their hands steady on the controls. The shuttle aligned with an ancient airlock, its edges weathered but intact. The connection engaged with a mechanical clang, the sound reverberating through the cabin. "Ready up," Drenner ordered, rising to his feet. The team followed suit, checking their weapons and gear. The airlock cycled open, revealing a corridor bathed in faint blue light. The air inside was stale but breathable, carrying a faint metallic tang. Drenner stepped forward, his boots clicking softly against the ancient floor. The corridor stretched ahead, its walls lined with shifting patterns that seemed to pulse in time with an unseen rhythm. Every step felt like an intrusion, the stillness broken only by the team's cautious movements. "Commander," Nix's voice echoed in his earpiece, "the Sanctum systems are monitoring your progress. They are aware of your presence." "Let them watch," Drenner muttered, his gaze scanning for any signs of movement. The corridor opened into a vast chamber, its ceiling arching high above like the inside of a cathedral. At its center stood a console, its surface glowing faintly with symbols that shifted as Drenner approached. The team spread out, their weapons trained on the shadows. "Nix, can you access this console?" Drenner asked. "Attempting," Nix replied. Its light flickered in Drenner's visor as the symbols began to rearrange, forming a language that was both alien and hauntingly familiar. "Commander," Nix said after a moment, its tone heavy with urgency, "the Sanctum's core is active. It is preparing for something." Drenner's pulse quickened. "Preparing for what?" Before Nix could answer, the chamber trembled, a deep vibration resonating through the floor. Symbols on the walls lit up in rapid succession, their light intensifying until the entire room was bathed in a blinding glow. "Defensive measures," Nix said. "The Sanctum is responding to our presence." "Fall back," Drenner ordered, his voice sharp. "Regroup at the airlock." The team moved swiftly, their footsteps echoing as the chamber continued to awaken. Drenner cast one last glance at the console before following, the weight of the Sanctum's secrets pressing heavily on his mind. As they retreated into the corridor, the sound of the Sanctum's awakening grew louder, a resonant crescendo that promised both revelation and peril. The chamber trembled as the Sanctum's ancient systems roared to life, their energy coursing through walls that pulsed like a living organism. Drenner's team sprinted back toward the airlock, their boots striking the metallic floor in sharp, echoing bursts. Behind them, the glow from the Sanctum's core intensified, casting elongated shadows that seemed to reach for them like grasping hands. "Move faster!" Drenner barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. His pulse pounded, each beat pushing him forward, but his gaze lingered on the faint light at the console. Something in the core had awakened, and it wasn't finished with them. "Commander, the Sanctum's energy levels are rising exponentially," Nix's voice said through the comm. "It is preparing a release, though the exact nature is unclear." "Release of what?" Voss demanded, his tone tinged with panic as he glanced over his shoulder. "Everything," Nix replied, the word heavy with finality. Drenner reached the airlock and turned back, his breath sharp as he surveyed the glowing corridor. "Nix, can we stabilize it?" "No," Nix said. The Sanctum systems have gone beyond manual control. It will do what it was built to do. And what is that? Drenner growled. Nix paused, its voice lowering. Decide whether you're worthy. The words settled like a stone in Drenner's chest. He tightened his grip on the airlock frame, the weight of them too enormous to ignore. He could feel the same thought racing through his team's minds, though none dared voice it aloud. A deep, resonating vibration surged through the station, and a blinding column of light erupted from the chamber behind them. It shot upward, piercing the sanctum's ceiling and into the void beyond, carving a jagged wound in the fabric of space itself. Nix's voice broke through the comm again, sharper now. Commander, the Valtyr fleet is arriving. They've detected the activation. Drenner's blood ran cold. Time to impact? 15 minutes, Nix replied. Their numbers are significant. Voss swore under his breath, his tendrils twitching nervously. We can't hold them off, not with what we've got left. We're not here to hold, Drennar said, his tone unyielding. We're here to finish this. He turned to the team. Get back to the Helios Eternal. I'll join you once we have control of the Sanctum. One of the engineers, a young luminar with a faintly glowing crystalline form, hesitated. Commander, if the station activates... Then it activates, Drenner snapped. We don't have time to debate. Go. The team obeyed, retreating into the shuttle as Drenner turned back toward the glowing core. The corridor had become a storm of light and sound, the patterns on the walls shifting faster than his eyes could follow. He advanced, his every step deliberate, his heart hammering with determination. The core chamber was now a whirlwind of energy, the console at its center glowing brighter than ever. Drenner approached, his hand brushing against its surface. The symbols reappeared, rearranging themselves into something he could understand. Do you trust them? The words burned into his mind, not spoken, but felt. He exhaled sharply, his throat dry as he answered. I trust what they could become. The console pulsed, the symbols shifting again. The next question came, sharper this time. Would they trust you? Drenner closed his eyes for a moment, his jaw tightening. Memories flooded back, of decisions made, lives lost, orders given with no guarantee of success. He opened his eyes, his gaze unwavering. They don't have to. They just need to survive. The light dimmed, and for a brief moment there was silence. Then the console erupted with a new projection, images and data flooding the room in a cascade of information. Plans for weapons, defenses, medical advancements, and more, all encoded with humanity's unique ingenuity. It was knowledge forged in desperation and preserved through unimaginable sacrifice. Nix, Drennar said, his voice steady. Can you transmit this to the fleet? I can, Nix replied, its tone carrying a rare hint of awe. But the process will expose the Sanctum's position. The Valtyr will focus everything they have on destroying it. Then we make it count, Drennar said. Send the data. The projection shifted again, showing the incoming Valtyr fleet. Hundreds of ships moved in eerie unison, their weapons glowing with lethal intent. The Coalition fleet held position around the Sanctum, a fragile shield against the storm that was about to descend. Nix's voice echoed through the chamber. Transmission initiated. Estimated completion, 12 minutes. Drennar stepped back, his gaze fixed on the tactical display. Voss, prepare the fleet for full engagement. I don't care if it's a suicide run. We hold until that data gets through. Voss's voice crackled through the comm, strained but resolute. Understood, Commander. It's been an honor. The words struck deeper than Drennar expected. He straightened, his grip on the console tightening. No honors yet, Voss. Let's survive this first. The first wave of Valtyr ships emerged from the void, their weapons tearing through space with terrifying precision. Coalition ships scrambled to intercept, their own weapons lighting up the dark. The Sanctum trembled as debris rained down, the battle raging on every front. Commander, Nix said, its voice cutting through the chaos. The Sanctum has activated its final failsafe. What does that mean? Drennar demanded. It is preparing to fold space, Nix replied, to take the Valtyr with it. Drennar's breath caught. And the fleet? It will not survive the fold, Nix said. Drennar stared at the display, the weight of the decision pressing down on him like a mountain. He turned back to the console, the glowing symbols reflecting in his eyes. "Override the failsafe," he ordered. Nix hesitated. "Commander, the Valtyr will destroy the Coalition if they are not stopped. And if we activate the fold, we lose everything the Sanctum is trying to preserve," Drenner said. "Override it." Nix's form flickered, its light dimming. "You place your trust in fragile alliances." "No," Drenner said quietly. "I place my trust in what they could become." The Sanctum's energy stabilized, the tremors fading. The projection shifted again, showing the Valtyr fleet retreating as the Coalition pressed forward. They were holding. Not winning, but holding. The transmission completed and Nix's voice returned. "Data relay successful. The fleet has received the plans." Drenner exhaled, the tension in his chest easing. He turned to the communication. "Voss, pull the fleet back. Regroup at the outer perimeter." "And you?" Voss asked, his voice tight. "I'm right behind you," Drennar said, his lips curving into a faint smile. The Sanctum's lights dimmed as the Helios Eternal led the Coalition fleet away, its crew carrying the weight of humanity's legacy. Drenner stood at the airlock, watching the station fade into the void. "Nix," he said softly, "what did the Guardians see in us?" Nix's voice was quieter now, almost reverent. "The ability to defy what should be inevitable." Drenner nodded, his resolve solid. "Let's make sure we prove them right." As the fleet regrouped and prepared for the battles ahead, the Sanctum remained, a silent sentinel, its secrets now woven into the fabric of a galaxy that would never be the same.